it's not unexpected, but it's still significant that the Omicron variant we've been telling you about is here. It's in the U.S. right now in California. We still don't have a total read on how dangerous it is or whether it's spread, but the message from the White House is very clear. Don't just get vaccinated, get boosted. We're live out west, and we're getting a gut check from one of our doctors in just a minute. And right before we came on the air, we found out that high school student suspected of shooting and killing 4 classmates made a video the night before about it and was called into a meeting along with his parents the morning the shooting happened, according to police. We don't know about what. We'll talk about why they say it happened, the charges against this suspect, and what we're learning about the victims coming up. Plus, the single most important legal showdown over abortion rights in at least 3 decades. We're reading the tea leaves on where we think the Supreme Court justices stand. And in Alec Baldwin's first interview since that deadly shooting on the set of his movie Rust, he says he never even pulled the trigger. What else he's sharing? And look, we got to talk about baseball. I know it's not the right season. They're not playing games right now, but they may not be anytime soon because of a big-time labor fight between the players and the owners. We'll have more on a key deadline tonight later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and even though we knew this day was coming with the Omicron variant now here in the U.S., it is still a key moment in the fight against this pandemic. So here's what we know about this case, which was tested at a lab in San Francisco and verified by the CDC. This is somebody in California. They got back from South Africa on November 22nd. Then a week later, they tested positive and are now quarantining. Dr. Anthony Fauci laid it out. Watch.
This is the first confirmed case of COVID-19 caused by the Omicron variant detected in the United States. We knew that it was just a matter of time before the first case of Omicron would be detected in the United States.
Dr. Fauci said this person was vaccinated but had not yet had their booster shot and said their symptoms were mild. He also suggested some new travel restrictions are probably in the works because of this variant. And the stock market doesn't like any of it, right? The news wiped out a 500-point gain in the Dow, which then sank another 400-plus points, as you see on the big board there. I want to get right to Aaron McLaughlin, who's covering this. Aaron, we heard from a number of people in California about this. The governor, the mayor of San Francisco, et cetera. Do we know anything else about the person who tested positive for this variant or if they think it's spreading at this point?
Yeah, we have details in terms of the timeline. This individual, according to Governor Gavin Newsom in a press conference just a short while ago, saying the individual arrived here in California from South Africa on the 22nd. A few days later, around the 25th, developed symptoms, became symptomatic with COVID-19, and then was tested on the 28th. That positive test result coming back on the 29th. UC San Francisco in the overnight hours, sequencing the sample and confirming Omicron. Now, officials here in California say they are prepared for this and there's no reason to panic. Take a listen.
We knew that Omicron was going to be here. We thought it was already here. We just hadn't detected it yet. So this is cause for concern, but it is also certainly not a cause for us to panic. We are prepared here in the city.
And officials say at this point they are not planning any new health orders, no new restrictions as a result of today's confirmation. Hallie.
Okay, but as we talk about restrictions, we know that there is the possibility that more may be on the way, right? What does that mean for all of us?
Yeah, well, that pertains to international travel restrictions. Dr. Fauci in that White House briefing today touching upon that, saying that it is possible that they could introduce new testing restrictions prior to departure for an international flight, potentially requesting a COVID test 24 hours prior to departure. Officials also have been talking about potential for requiring testing upon landing from an international flight. Dr. Fauci was specifically asked during that briefing about the possibility of requiring vaccinations for domestic travel. At this point, ruling that out. But clearly, this is a fluid situation, and authorities are assessing information as they get it.
Aaron McLaughlin. Aaron, thank you so much. I appreciate you reporting for us. I know you've been busy there in California covering all of these developments just after they broke a few hours ago. I want to bring in Dr. Kavita Patel for what I call the gut check, and that's what I need from you, Dr. Patel, the reality check, right? What, if anything, do we need to do differently now that Omicron is here, besides not freak out?
Yeah, Hallie, that is right. And I'll underscore and emphasize that, not freak out. And trust me, even I had a little kind of revisiting of how I felt in February 2020. And I had to remind myself, to your point about what can we do now, as individuals up to date on vaccinations. I think it was interesting. Governor Newsom and his Secretary of Health made a point of saying that this individual had not received their booster, but that's because this individual had actually received their initial vaccine series within the last 6 months. So it's just a reminder that, we need to stay up to date on immunizations. That includes boosters. I think it also does just make you cautious about where you go. If you're in a crowded place with a bunch of people, you don't know their vaccine status, higher likelihood, Hallie, if this is more infectious than Delta, that it could be an opportunity to spread it, and I would avoid those situations for now. So those are the best things we can do.
That is really helpful, I think, guidance to hear from you. I want to talk about this booster thing, right? Because we heard that over and over again from top health officials today. Get your booster shot, get your booster shot. Explain why that is so important, right? Explain why that, because it's not as though the booster is specifically tweaked for this variant, right?
Right, that's correct. And that is very important, Hallie, to point out. This isn't a, quote, new vaccine. It's basically the same thing you got if you had Pfizer or Moderna, just a different dose if you had Moderna. And the reason it's important in this setting in particular, it boosts not only your original vaccine response, but the booster tells your own natural cells that make antibodies to kind of create even broader antibodies than what the initial vaccine series produced, meaning you could have better response to a variant that the body hasn't even seen, like Omicron, if you get that booster. I also want to level set, though. We're going to get some we'll get some antibody data on how good our current vaccines fight this variant, probably by next week, end of next week. I want to set the expectation. It will not be in the 90s like our current vaccines. It will likely be lower. The question is how much lower and what can we do about it?
Can I just ask you about the potential for these new travel restrictions for people coming into the U.S., the idea that those might be announced sometime this week, right? And there's been some criticism here of, does that matter, right? If Omicron is already here, if that's the case, does it matter with these travel restrictions in place? We've heard the White House say, hey, at least that buys us some time to get people boosted. But I wonder, in your sort of professional opinion here, your assessment, how you see that.
Yeah, there's no scientific evidence that travel restrictions, meaning limiting incoming or kind of limiting outgoing travel, will actually have an effect, especially now that we know it's here, which we always had that inkling. But what I think could be incredibly helpful, which we've also heard inklings of from the administration, is doing that testing. It's right now 3 days before you leave from an outside U.S. country. This could be narrowing that to 24 hours before you leave. And you could use a rapid test, Hallie, but it has to be proctored, meaning somebody else has to watch you get it and make sure you're doing it properly and look at the results. I think you could also expect potentially to see backside when you land in the United States, potentially testing requirements. And even more controversial would be quarantine requirements. If this individual who landed on the 22nd had actually quarantined, who knows what could have been prevented and tested, might have caught it earlier. A lot of coulda, shoulda right now, but that could be more helpful than anything.
Dr. Kavita Patel, it's always great to have you on. Appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
So right as we were getting ready to come on the air for the show, we watched the student accused of shooting and killing 4 classmates in Michigan Tuesday in court for an arraignment, some of it virtual, on charges including first-degree murder and terrorism. That happened right after we found out from police that he apparently made a video the night before the shooting, wrote about it in a journal, and then the morning it happened had been called into a meeting along with his parents for what police called concerning behavior. I want to show you, by the way, these are his parents watching that arraignment from their car. And listen, on this show, it's really important for us not to lose sight of the victims here, the students who were killed, 4 of them now, after 17-year-old Justin Schilling died this morning. Hannah St. Juliana was just 14 years old. Tate Meyer, a 16-year-old linebacker for the school's football team, was killed, as was Madison Baldwin. She was 17. She was supposed to graduate this spring. 3 other students are in the hospital now, and 4 other people, including a teacher, have been treated and released. I want to go to Shaq Brewster in Michigan with today's developments. And Shaq, we'll get into the charges. We'll get into the rest of that in a second. But talk about this update from the sheriff on the investigation. He says the shooter is still not cooperating, but there were these quote, concerning behaviors that were enough for him to be called into basically the school office the day before the shooting, the morning of the shooting, right?
That's exactly right. And we got a pretty extensive update from the county sheriff earlier today. And while he denied any idea that the shooter or suspected shooter was familiar to them, that he was on law enforcement radar at all, he did say that he was on the radar of school officials, that he had meetings, or excuse me, the suspected shooter had meetings with school officials as recently as this week. Listen to what the sheriff said about that.
The schools did have contact with the student the day before and the day of the shooting for behavior in the classroom that they felt was concerning. In fact, the parents were brought in the morning of the shooting and had a face-to-face meeting with the school.
That face-to-face meeting happened hours before this 15-year-old sophomore is alleged or accused of then opening fire at around 1 p.m. just yesterday, Hallie. There's a lot of video evidence that they've been going through. This investigation is going to go on for some time, but we learned a lot just in that update today.
As we talk about video, Shaq, I'm going to ask my control room to pull up this piece of video that made the rounds on social media, right? It is scary to watch. It is scary for the students who are in this video. But the sheriff is saying, hey, it's not actually what you think it is. I want to play that, and then I'm going to ask you about it. Let me see if we can roll that here.
Sheriff's office. It's safe to come out.
Yeah, he said it's safe to come out.
Now, we're not willing to take that risk right now. I can't hear you. We're not taking that risk right now. Okay, well, come to the door and look at my bag, bro.
No. Yeah, bro.
He said bro.
He said bro. Red flag.
And at that point, Shaq, you see the kids, they run. The rest of the video shows them basically going out a window or a door leading into a courtyard or leading outside. The sheriff says, listen, there is some misinformation. The shooter never actually knocked on a door. He was apparently in the hallway after coming out of the bathroom with the gun the whole time.
That's right. And in the back end of that video, you see them go through what's a window or door. It's not really clear exactly what it is, but when they get to the other side of the courtyard, they're greeted by members of law enforcement who then tell them you're safe. It's okay. And the sheriff went through not only that story, but went through some other misinformation that's been out there. But he said the shooter never actually knocked on a door through the classroom or in that school. They know that by going through some of the surveillance video. They did say while he never knocked on any doors, there were some bullet holes or there were evidence of gunfire into some of the doors of the classroom. And one thing that you heard the sheriff do was underscore and almost celebrate the lockdown procedures that have become so accustomed to students, not just here in Michigan, but really all around the country. He said had that lockdown not happened, then more lives likely or possibly would have been lost, Hallie.
Yeah, he said possibly the person knocking and that you heard on that video might have been another officer who was trying to kind of connect and use relatable language with the students in the room. Talk about these charges, right? Because some of them or, for example, the terrorism charge. You heard the sheriff react pretty strongly to that as this 15-year-old, Ethan Crumbley, is being tried as an adult.
Yeah, let's tick through those charges because these are serious charges and they are extensive, and that's part of why he was denied bail just a couple of minutes ago. You start with that first count of terrorism causing death. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but then you have the 4 counts of first-degree murder for the 4 victims in this shooting, the 7 counts of assault with intent to murder, and 12 counts of possession of a firearm and the commission of a felony. Now, going back to that first terrorism charge, that sounds a little bit unusual, but the prosecutor explained it in a press conference earlier this afternoon.
What about all these other children? What about all the children who ran, screaming, hiding under desks? What about all the children at home right now who can't eat and can't sleep and can't imagine a world where they could ever foot back in that school? Those are victims too.
She explained that because of the scale of this tragedy, because so many people were traumatized in this, that explains that first terrorism charge, Hallie.
Shaq Brewster, live for us there, covering this. A very difficult story. Shaq, thank you for bringing that to us. I appreciate it. Back here in Washington, some major news out of the Supreme Court today. Based on what we heard in arguments on the most significant abortion case in decades, it seems like, and listen, reading the tea leaves, listening to the questions being asked, listening to the experts, that justices are ready, it seems, to uphold a Mississippi law that would undercut nearly 50 years of precedent that started back with Roe versus Wade. This is the case, you probably heard about it, that involves Mississippi's only abortion clinic and the state's law that bans most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. So Mississippi wants the court to overturn 2 historic decisions that say women have a constitutional right to an abortion before what's called fetal viability. Basically, that's the point of survival outside the womb, generally thought to be about 24 weeks. The case will be decided by a court seen as more sympathetic to people against abortion than any in a generation, with a 6-3 conservative majority. And that includes the 3 justices nominated by former President Trump, who explicitly said he wanted them to overturn Roe. So we had a chance to listen in live as it was happening to the arguments in court today. Here's some of that.
For 50 years, they've kept this court at the center of a political battle that it can never resolve. And 50 years on, they stand alone. Nowhere else does this court recognize a right to end a human life.
If states can take control of women's bodies and force them to endure months of pregnancy and childbirth, then they will never have equal status under the Constitution.
I want to bring in our Pete Williams to break this down for us. So, Pete, I'm glad to have you on. You are our court watcher. You are our court expert. Why does it seem like many observers are saying, hey, the justices seem likely to some degree, uphold the Mississippi law?
Well, I think you're right. Based on their comments, I think you're also right to caveat it and say it's one thing to listen to them in the heat of the moment, and then when they all get together to write the decision, as they stand there at the edge of the cliff, will they really jump off and overturn Roe? And I think we don't know that yet. But it did seem pretty clear that there are at least 6 votes on the court to uphold the Mississippi law. And as you point out, that would undercut the central holding of Roe, the viability test. Chief Justice John Roberts clearly is there. He said if this is an issue of choice, why isn't it enough choice to give a woman 15 weeks to decide whether to seek an abortion or not? Then the question is, will they go the whole way? But even if they undercut Roe simply by ending the viability standard, I mean, 2 things about that. Number one is, as Julie Rickleman, the lawyer for the Center for Constitutional Rights, representing the Mississippi Clinic, said today, well, then what's the end point? If the next state comes in and says 14 weeks and then 12 and then 6, like Texas, how does the court draw the line there? Of course, some of the justices would draw the line at 0. They think that no abortion should be allowed. The second thing is, if the court does even overturn Roe or even just limit it by upholding the Mississippi law, that doesn't ban abortion nationwide, but it does free up the states to make their own decisions, and about half of them would make abortion illegal.
And they already, many of them have these provisions in place. It would basically be triggered if that were to happen.
Now, some of the laws are based explicitly on overturning Roe, so it's not entirely clear to us how many of those actually would come into effect. But if you undercut the central holding of Roe, I'm sure the states will want to give it a shot.
One of the interesting things was listening to the way that the justices were talking with each other, I think, today. And in some instances, it seemed trying to send a message with what they were saying that reached well beyond, you know, the Supreme Court there. I want to play a quick line from Justice Sotomayor, who we should note is a supporter of abortion rights. Watch.
Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? I don't see how it is possible.
I mean, survive the stench. She's like really using some language here.
So it was framed as a question to the Solicitor General from Mississippi, but that is an example of how the justices are talking to each other. And the court's other 2 liberals, Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer, made a similar point. They both said we can't make this decision seem like we're changing our minds about this only because there's new members of the court now or there's a lot of political pressure. So how will they frame the decision to make it look like it's not political? You know, many of the justices on both sides were saying before this term started, sort of knowing what the stakes were. We're not a political body. We're not just politicians in robes. But so this will be a real chore for them.
Mississippi actually changed its argument in some ways after the makeup of the court. It was changed from what it initially had been, though. I mean, they identified the political shift in this court and took that tactic.
Right. The Mississippi applied for the court to take the case when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still a justice and said, don't worry, you don't have to overturn Roe. Then when Amy Coney Barrett came on the court and they submitted their briefs, they said, OK, let's get with it. Let's overturn Roe.
Right. We should talk about here, too. I think it's really important to not lose sight of what you said, that they're not deciding this tonight. They're not deciding this tomorrow, right? They're going to walk up, as you said, to the edge of the cliff, look over. We are likely to not know the results of this and the decision that they make probably until June. Fair?
Oh, yeah. We will not know the end of this story for several more months, at least 6 months. Something this controversial will go through several drafts, and we're not going to see it until much before the end of the term. And by the way, I don't know when we're going to see the Texas case, because if the court does say that the central holding of Roe doesn't apply anymore, well, that does play into the Texas law a little bit, even though that case is about the structure of the law. Can a state structure a law so that state officials don't, it's basically freelancing out to freelancers to enforce a law. Can you do that?
Right. That's the law that would essentially ban most abortions, almost all abortions in Texas after 6 weeks.
Not would, but is.
Right. Currently in place, which is before most women know they're pregnant. And as you point out, has this statute that would allow private citizens to enforce the law, not state officials. we should still be hearing from them on that?
Well, you know, you would think that we would get that decision on a fast track because they hurried up the argument and held it very quickly. But I don't know to what extent are these two now bound together, and we're not going to get them until both at the end. We could conceivably get the Texas case first because it is strictly not about abortion right. It is strictly about the structure.
The mechanism of it. Yeah. I could talk with you for 45 more minutes, Pete, about all things court
I'll wait in the parking lot.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate your time. We got other news coming into us, including that supply chain crisis. Soon to be in the rearview mirror, maybe. The president today is trying to lay out his plan to get the ports moving again, including some financial incentives, money for faster pickup, for more flexible work hours for people who drive trucks. Also promising shelves are going to be stocked for the holiday shopping season and that Americans should see some lower gas prices soon. He also asked whether the Omicron variant could serve as another blow to those supply chains. That was a question he got. Watch his response.
I think the jury's still out. I think it's a little early to make that judgment. But am I concerned? Of course I am, until we get the final answers.
NBC's Monica Alba is posted up for us at the White House. Mon, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you. Listen, these are remarks that we thought we were going to hear from the president a couple days ago. He had this meeting with the CEOs that went long. He had done, some chatting with reporters. So now he's talking, saying shelves will be stocked. Gas prices will come down. That sounds great, right? Who doesn't want to hear that? How realistic is it?
And part of the reason we understand, Hallie, that he delayed those remarks that were supposed to take place Monday to today is because he wanted to spend more time with those CEOs, getting assurances from them that those are promises he would be able to make today. And it seems that the White House is optimistic based on some encouraging factors. They're coming out and saying those shelves will have toys on them, those grocery stores will not be empty, and that Americans should not be that worried. And they're pointing to some signs where there have been encouraging upticks in movement in some of the log jams we've seen at ports. So actions that this White House feels they already took, things the president trying to make the argument today that he's not just sitting back and content to wait on this stuff, that he wants to use every tool available. So this is something where they do believe that come Christmas, they will be able to make these promises, though, of course, the president made a bit of a joke and said he can't guarantee every tree is going to be under the Christmas tree come December 25th. Only Santa Claus can do that, Hallie, so take note. But he did also say that this is something where they're trying to do everything possible, and it's not just about the ports, it's not just about trying to extend trucker hours, but also doing things like that strategic petroleum reserve, releasing some of those barrels so that Americans can start to see a little bit of a relief when it comes to gas prices. But of course, all of these things are inextricably linked, and the other big thing the president is saying here is that Americans aren't just going to see relief overnight. It is going to take a little bit of time, but he was sounding more optimistic today than he has sometimes in the past.
But Monica, can Santa Claus bring down inflation? Because that would be the ultimate political gift for President Biden right now, as his administration struggles with that. Republicans criticizing their actions. The president saying today, hey, if you pass my big agenda, my $1.7+ trillion climate and social spending bill, that could actually help on that front.
And let's continue this gifting analogy, Hallie, because it's really quite relevant, since the president today called out a Republican senator who did say just a few weeks ago soaring inflation is, quote, like a gold mine to us. And the president said, why should Republicans and his critics in particular be celebrating something that is hurting Americans, where they are feeling the pinch? So the president is absolutely trying to frame this from the perspective that if his agenda does get passed, if they do get this social spending and climate bill through the next phases on Capitol Hill, which again, all would have to happen in the next few weeks, and there's no guarantee that's done by Christmas. He's saying that could bring down the cost of things like child care, health care, elder care, while Americans are feeling, again, the pain in their pocketbooks and other places. But that still has a very uphill climb. And again, these deadlines are all just going to come clashing right before Santa comes to town.
Monica Alba, live for us at the White House North Lawn. Mon, thank you very much. Appreciate it. More testimony coming in from Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's accusers, with all the victims saying Maxwell groomed them for sex. One even says Jeffrey Epstein introduced her to Donald Trump when she was just 14. Our man at the court, Tom Winter, is standing by with more details, breaking just in the last little bit here. Plus, have you heard about this? Half the families of the Astroworld victims turning down Travis Scott's offer to pay for funeral costs. Why some are saying the rapper's money is no good to him. we've been talking about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that's happening now on day 3. And now we're hearing from the first Epstein accuser to speak in the case for the second day. And this time it was under cross-examination. Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer tried to punch holes in this accuser's testimony today, saying it didn't match what she told the government in interviews from 2019. You also heard more testimony today about Epstein's famous friends, with this accuser, Jane, that's a pseudonym, also saying she met former President Trump at Mar-a-Lago when she was just 14. Back in 2019, you might remember Mr. Trump said he knew Epstein like everybody in Palm Beach knew him, adding that he was not a fan. Tom Winter has been on this story. Tom, I understand you have just walked away from a news conference that happened like literally as we were on the air for the show with somebody, I believe, a relative of Jane, right, of the woman who's been on the stand for the last couple days.
Actually, Hallie, yeah, there was a little bit of confusion in that. It was actually Kevin Maxwell, who's the brother of Ghislaine Maxwell, who's standing trial. He spoke. It was the first time we saw him at court today. He was with his sister, obviously Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. She did not speak, but Kevin Maxwell just coming out to say, look, he appreciated that he was finally able to say hello to his sister. He says it was the first time in 500 days, over 500 days, that he's been able to speak with her. Thank the marshals for at least allowing him to say hello and see how she was doing. He says that he has faith in the U.S. legal system. He's upset about the conditions that Maxwell's being held in. It's something she's complained about often in court papers and through her defense attorneys. She's been held, obviously, since her arrest, Hallie, but he said he wouldn't be commenting further on the proceedings out of respect for the U.S. legal system. So that's what we just heard from him. As far as testimony, you know, you hit it right on the head. The cross-examination today going after really the memory, or trying to go after the memory of Jane, the first accuser who was called to the stand yesterday afternoon. Her cross-examination lasted through lunch, lasted after lunch today. A couple of points that the defense was trying to get to is this idea that she told federal investigators one thing, which was summarized in notes, not recorded, told them one thing, and then later testified yesterday to something else on redirect to federal prosecutors asking her about that and about any potential discrepancies, essentially saying, look, over time, she says she felt more comfortable talking to prosecutors about certain events and certain things that happened. She got very emotional, the most emotional she's been throughout the entirety of her testimony, Hallie, talking about how the fact that essentially, if she could, she would give back the money she got from the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund. She hoped that today's testimony and this would provide closure and allow her to move beyond this very long chapter in her life.
One of the things we've been hearing about, even over the last several days, has been, you know, these high-profile friends, basically, or high-profile people who knew Jeffrey Epstein. And Jane testified she was on a flight with Prince Andrew, met Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, that there wasn't any inappropriate behavior. I think, Tom, you've reached out to the former president's office for any comment, right? Anything there?
Right. NBC News has reached out to the former president's office for comment to ask them about that interaction, if the president remembers it or has any sort of statement. Obviously, if we get that, we'll be happy to share that and pass it along. We have not heard back from the president yet. As you know, Hallie, very well, he's issued a number of statements the last few days. His name coming up at trial yesterday, obviously coming up here again today. It's important to remember the context in which this was asked. It wasn't really clear to us why the defense was asking these questions. They said, look, did you remember going to Mar-a-Lago, being driven by Epstein in this green special sports car to Mar-a-Lago to meet the president? She says yes, but she didn't describe if the meeting occurred, what, if anything, the president said. And there was certainly no allegation that the president did anything improper. And I think it's important to note that context.
I think that's important. I'm glad you did. Real quick, Tom, we're still going to hear from, I think, at least 3 other accusers in this trial, right?
That's exactly correct. So we just wrapped up testimony before coming out to speak with you today with the ex-boyfriend of Jane, who testified to some of the things that Jane told him while they were dating in the mid-2000s to early 20-teens. So some of his statements appear to corroborate some of the things that Jane told the jury yesterday and today. We do expect to hear 3 more accusers today. A little bit of foundation testimony at the end of the day. A person who worked at the music school that Jane says she was at when she first met Epstein. Hallie.
Tom Winter, live for us there outside court. Tom, really glad to have you back tonight to walk us through all that. Appreciate it. Half the families who lost loved ones during the Astroworld concert last month are rejecting Travis Scott's offer to pay for their funerals. Listen to this. The attorney for the family of the youngest victim, 9-year-old Ezra Blunt, responded to Scott's offer, saying, in part, your client's offer is declined. saying his journey ahead will be painful. He must face and hopefully see that he bears some of the responsibility for this tragedy. He goes on to say, quote, Mr. Scott must respect the fact that his pain and his devastation pale to Treston's, Ezra Blunt's father, to Ezra's mom, and to the other victims. Blunt was one of 10 people who died when fans rushed the stage when Scott performed at the Astroworld Festival. More than 120 lawsuits have been filed on that front. Coming up, support for Peng Shuai is still coming in, this time from the Women's Tennis Association, suspending tournaments in China because they're so worried about the safety of the tennis star. So is this a decision that's going to actually help her? Plus, a new development in that movie set shooting where a cinematographer was killed in October. A new search warrant could tell us how live ammo ended up on the set of Rust and into the gun fired by Alec Baldwin. Major League Baseball facing its first lockout in 25 years. We'll talk about what's at stake if a new collective bargaining agreement isn't hit before midnight tonight. Clock's ticking. We're just a little bit away. Morgan Chesky has some answers. But first, let's get you to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the wife of music legend Clarence Avant was shot and killed this morning. Police say Jacqueline Avant died in an apparent home invasion at the couple's home in Beverly Hills. Number 2, the Women's Tennis Association says it's suspending all of its tournaments in China. Why? Because the organization's CEO says he cannot in good conscience hold matches there because he hasn't been able to talk freely with Peng Shuai, who you see here, the tennis star from China. Last month, remember, she accused a former Chinese official of sexual assault and then disappeared, basically, from public view. Number 3, people in Honduras have elected Xiomara Castro as their first female president. Her rival conceded Tuesday. Back in 2017, there were deadly protests because of a contested election. Number 4, you know the most expensive city in the world to live in? Tel Aviv. That's what a survey by the Economist Intelligence Unit says. The Israeli city came out on top for the very first time. You'd think maybe Paris would be on that list. It's tied for second, along with Singapore. Number 5, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. There she is. The annual Rockefeller Christmas tree lighting in New York happens tonight. This beaut came from Elkton, Maryland, 85 years old, 79 feet tall, and pretty soon is set to be head to toe in lights. That'll be a fun one to watch tonight. Alec Baldwin, given his first interview since he accidentally, he says, shot the gun that killed the cinematographer on the set of the movie Rust. ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos talked with him and says it was the most intense interview he's ever done. Watch some of what Baldwin says.
Someone put a live bullet in a gun, a bullet that wasn't even supposed to be on the property. She was someone who was loved by everyone who worked with and liked by everyone who worked with and admired.
Helena Hutchins was killed when the gun went off during filming. That bullet also hit the director, Joel Souza. The interview's coming as we're getting a new clue into how those live rounds may have gotten onto the set in the first place. They're not supposed to be there, but a search warrant affidavit says they might have come from this famous stuntman, a guy named Thel Reed. He's the father of Hannah Gutierrez Reed, who was the armorer for the movie. Emily Ikeda joins us now from Los Angeles with more on the interview and the investigation. So let's take it in that order. Emily, let's start with the interview. And Baldwin says he never pulled the trigger. Then how did this gun go off? How did this happen? How does he explain that?
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces here. There are several accounts around how the live ammo could have ended up on set. In the latest court documents, famous weapons expert, as you mentioned, stuntman Thel Reed, tells authorities he had taken live rounds to another set earlier this year for training. He says he did this at the request of Seth Kenny, a weapon supplier who later provided ammo to the Rust film set. Reed told investigators after the training he tried getting the remaining ammunition back from Kenny, but the affidavit indicates Kenny told him to, quote, write it off. But Kenny suggested a different timeline to investigators. Authorities say he told authorities the live ammo could stem from several years ago when he received reloaded ammunition from a friend. So a couple of competing theories here, Hallie.
Absolutely, and I think some twists to follow on that. Are we hearing anything from any of the attorneys involved in the cases here?
Yeah, well, certainly Hannah Gutierrez Reed, her legal team applauding the search warrant to examine Seth Kenny, who I mentioned earlier, writing in a statement in part, the questions of who introduced the live rounds onto the set and why are the central questions in the case. The warrant is a major step towards answering those questions. For background, Hannah Gutierrez Reed has really faced a lot of criticism being the armorer of this movie set, the person who not only controls and is in charge of the weaponry, but the person who also reportedly loaded the gun gun. Authorities have made clear from the beginning this investigation could take weeks. No one at this point has been charged. Hallie?
I think we have a little bit more from that interview that Alec Baldwin, I should say, did with ABC News. Let me see if we can play it here.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger.
So is Baldwin here saying, Emily, that the gun just went off accidentally?
Yeah, it appears to be that way. I think we'll gain more insight when we see a larger portion of the interview. But again, authorities say that Baldwin was the one who fired the gun. But in here, you're hearing from Alec Baldwin that he's insisting he did not fire or pull the trigger. Hallie?
Emily Ikeda, thank you very much. Live for us there on that story. So listen, we know that except for where Emily is in Southern California, for the rest of it, it's basically the middle of winter. It is cold. It is not the spring. It is not baseball season, but we've got to talk about it because tonight at midnight, MLB's 30 owners are set to lock the players out because of this dispute. Baseball makes billions of dollars a year. Players make pretty good money, but apparently that is not enough to stop this labor dispute. Take a look at the numbers here, right? Back in 2019, MLB set a revenue record. They raked in nearly $11 billion. And salaries for the players, listen, by like real world standards, you'd love to be a baseball player. Your typical player, your run-of-the-mill bench guy probably makes more than $1 million. But the salaries for those guys have gone down, while money for stars like Max Scherzer have gone way, way up. Even with all of this, right, they're about to close the industry down. There's about to be this lockout. And right now, these players and those billionaire owners seem to, despise each other. There's not a lot of trust. For the first time in more than 25 years, this could even threaten some games. Morgan Chesky is in Texas, where owners and union leaders have been negotiating. All right, Morgan, baseball is still making money. The players are making money. Look at all these contracts that have been handed out in just this past week alone, right? Max Scherzer is the eyeball-popping one, but it's nearly $900 million, as you look at it here, to just 5 guys. And the values for these franchises are going way up, too. So what, my friend, is the problem here, right? Why is there a sticking point between the owners and the players?
Yeah, well, there's several sticking points here, Hallie. And as of today, these discussions that we're having inside a Four Seasons conference room, not too far away from where I'm standing, sources have described as having little to no compromise going forward. And that means if that happens, that lockout's happening at 11:59 tonight Eastern time, effectively locking any trades or any team activity. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The major sticking points here are really 5 key things that we've been focusing on. The players want to lower the free agency at age 29 and a half or after 5 years of service time, whichever comes first. Players also want to become arbitration eligible after 2 seasons rather than 3. And meanwhile, the MLB wants to expand to a 12-team postseason with leagues realigned to 2 divisions each. There's also a luxury tax threshold raised from $210 million to $240 million. And as you can see right there, they want to have a universal designated hitter. We've seen too many pitchers swing at air too many times. They're trying to make it more competitive, more enjoyable for everyone to watch. So those are some of the key sticking points here. The list really does go on, but I think the key thing to take away right now is that they've been having these conversations for hours now inside this conference room, and there's been little to no compromise as of right now.
At what point, listen, spring training is still a couple months away. At what point do we have to worry that we're not going to see like spring training games, we're not going to see regular season games? Are we still weeks away from that yet?
Yeah, we are. We're months away, in fact. However, it's been described as unlikely to happen, but within the realm of possibilities. Spring training starts in February. If they cannot come to some sort of collective agreement before then, we're going to see that impacted. And fans who like to travel to their team's spring training facilities to see them before the upcoming season, they're going to feel that.
That's right.
If spring training gets impacted enough, that's when we're starting to see kind of the impact happen in the regular season. So we anticipate this to potentially wrap up within the next several weeks. But if it goes longer, I would tell a baseball fan that's when you want to start to be maybe getting a little concerned about how this is going to impact your team. Not to even mention the trade impact and the signing impact as well, because that all stops as soon as this lockout goes into effect.
Morgan, I'm not ashamed to talk about it. I was 10 years old the last time that a lockout happened, 1994, when it affected actual games, right? The relationship seemed to get better. Now the relationship seems to be at another serious low, right?
Mm-hmm. these happen every 5 years, these collective bargaining agreements between the Players Association and MLB. The last one happened in much more normal times, right? Since then, well, we've had the pandemic, and we've seen the players had to forego about half to 2/3 of their salary during the pandemic. Owners are saying they lost a collective of about $2.5 billion. So money is front and center when it comes to this conversation. And that certainly, I think, exacerbated the need for both sides to perhaps stay in their respective camps instead of reaching an agreement as of right now.
That's good context. Morgan, how old were you in 1994? Do you care to share with our audience here?
You know,
I won't put you on the spot.
A gentleman never tells, but no, I was 8. I was 8 years old.
All right, fine, good.
And
Cheers.
you know,
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you, friend.
So and I grew up. Yeah, no problem.
We'll talk baseball. I'll text you. We'll talk about it. We'll get you back on the show. Thank you, Morgan Chesky, live for us there with that great reporting.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. So listen, cannabis is legal in California in many instances, right? But they're having a big problem with illegal marijuana farms right now, and it's really hurting the national forest there. You've got drug traffickers leaving behind trash, guns, and oh, by the way, poison. Cynthia McFadden went to one. She's going to tell us what she saw in our backstory. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our New York bureau, a huge explosion at a building in Brooklyn ended up in a fire, hurting 6 people and leaving dozens out in the cold. You can see the video here. It also burned through some houses right nearby. Con Edison was sent over to look at a possible gas emergency after it happened, but we still aren't sure if that or what specifically set off the explosion. Also, out of our New York bureau, the federal government is asking ships southeast of the city to literally slow down to keep a rare species of whale safe. Scientists say that these whales are more at risk to get hit by ships or tangled up in fishing gear while they're passing through. So they put in place this protected zone that's going to be in effect until Sunday. So ships, hit the brakes, save our whales. From our Midwest bureau. Denver maybe missed the memo that winter is coming. The city's actually making weather history because it still has not seen its first snow of the year. Denver is kicking off the start of December without any snowfall for the first time ever. And the National Weather Service says it's not like there's a ton in the forecast. They may not get any for a little while yet. Time to get the backstory now. Our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. Tonight, we're talking about cannabis and the illegal side to the marijuana industry happening right now in California. You may have heard of these weed farms, right? Illegal weed farms. But did you know that some of them are growing on federal forest land? They're run by these huge drug cartels who are making millions of dollars, even though cannabis is legal in California. These illegal sales are at $8 billion a year. That's almost double the amount of money that the legal market is bringing in. But there are some really big dangers that come from these farms. First of all, they're using pesticides that are banned and creating what experts call the circle of death. That's when growers use pesticides that kill animals, then another animal eats that dead animal and then also dies. That's how bad it is. We have to talk about the cycle of death. Not good. Second, some of these farms are setting off wildfires because when growers set up shop, oftentimes they'll bring cigarettes, they'll bring open flame stoves, wood fires to this land that's already so susceptible to burning up. NBC News actually identified 6 wildfires on Forest Service and tribal land caused by these illegal weed sites. On top of this, there's barely any money set aside to tackle this problem. Cynthia McFadden is joining us now. She got the rare opportunity to go take a look at these farms to see what's going on there. She's our backstory for us tonight. Cynthia, I'm so glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
It's great to be with you, Hallie. Congratulations on the new show.
Thank you, my friend. So listen, our loyal viewers will know that you have been covering this issue, right, of marijuana for a long time here. But when we think about California and weed, like it's not like I'm immediately thinking, oh, yes, cartel-run farms and national forests, right? How did you first find out about this story? What drew you to it?
Well, actually, one of my producers, Kenzie Abousabi, got a phone call from a publicist who we were working on another story, not pot related, who said, you know, I've been talking to some folks out in California, and I think there's a real issue here. So it was really, sometimes, as you know, Hallie, the best tips come from the most unlikely places. We haven't ever done the original story, by the way, that we were working on with him originally, but she started digging, and we finally made our way to the Forest Service, and they had never allowed anyone to go in before, but they said, yeah, hey, this is really a crisis, and we want you to take a look so the public can understand. Yeah.
Cynthia, you didn't just go in. You got in a chopper. You're like hanging out the doors. You're looking for these farms, right? We're seeing some of the video of you really in the thick of it in this thing. Tell me how that was.
I would say not hanging out the doors.
Okay, fine.
But I was terrified that I might
you were,
go
let me, for
out the
legal
door.
and standards
When
reasons, I will say you were fully harnessed in a very safe manner, buckled up. Thank you.
Let me tell you what the safety briefing goes like. The first thing they say is, Cynthia, we want to tell you how to land the helicopter in case something happens to the pilot. I said, you're talking to the wrong person. Then they say, oh, by the way, make sure you don't have a pen or a phone or anything because there are no doors. If something goes out the window, it goes into the rotor and you crash. So, I was very, very happy to see what we could see and to land. But yeah, it's part of the job.
And then once you're on, solid land, you're then hiking through the forest with some of these officers. We're showing our audience some of the video of you on this journey here. I know that takes preparation. And I know, one of the interesting things about this, as a reporter, cannabis is mainstream now, right? I mean, I think that's very fair to say. Many states are legalizing it. I wonder what it was like to see this other side of it, right? The cycle of death, the poisoning animals, the wildfires piece of it.
To be honest, Hallie, the pot was the least of the story. I mean, when you realize, you mentioned that NBC can confirm 6 direct, these sites causing direct forest fires in California. We're now up to 13 sites. 13 fires in California, some of the most devastating fires in California caused by these grow sites. These horrific chemicals that are being used that are killing not just wildlife but seeping into the water system. I mean, 50% of the water supply in California comes from the national forest. This has to be stopped, and it has to be stopped really not because of the weed per se, but because of all the secondary effects. By the way, they really don't know whether these chemicals are seeping into the weed, which it may well be doing. It's one of those stories that you start scratching the surface and you see how much there is there.
So was the whole thing sort of a surprising journey for you, or was there one specific moment, Cynth, where you were like, oh my God, I've been covering this issue for a long time and this blows my mind?
Honestly, I wish I could have a really serious answer for you. I will tell you, though, the moment that blew my mind, which is when I looked at this path that we were going to be climbing through for, I don't know, I guess it was 3 hours in and 3 hours out through dense forest, and the first 500 feet is straight down. I did not like my chances. I want to say I am a person who thinks roughing it is slow room service. This was not the story for me. But you do what has to be done. They applauded at the end because they were so sure that I was never going to make it. I made it. I did it. It was not pretty. We had to take out a lot of video of me sweating and crying, but we did it. And to be able to see it firsthand, that was it for me. Anyway,
I just love you so much, and thank you. And I appreciate your journey of survival that you embarked on to bring us this story. Seriously, Cynthia, it's such a great piece of reporting.
There you go.
And I love talking to you behind the scenes of how it all came together. Thank you, friend. Appreciate it.
Until next time.
Bye, Sid. Coming up here on the show, you might know the name Alice Siebold. She's the author of The Lovely Bones, huge book hit. Well, she is now apologizing to the man who was wrongly convicted of her 1981 rape. He was exonerated just last week, but Siebold says she's struggling with the role she played, sending an innocent man to prison. Kristen Dahlgren has more on how this happened next. A man wrongly accused of raping a famous author is getting an apology now after Alice Siebold falsely claimed Anthony Broadwater raped her back in 1981 at Syracuse University. Broadwater did 16 years in prison and had to register as a sex offender after he was released in 1998. The conviction was finally overturned last week. And just this week, just yesterday, Siebold posted a statement saying, quote, "I am sorry most of all for the fact that the life you could have led was unjustly robbed from you." Now, here's the thing. Siebold wrote a memoir called Lucky about everything that happened in 1999. Now, her publishers are saying they're not going to distribute the book. They're going to press pause on that until they and Siebold figure out a way to revise it so that it deals with this false accusation. Kristen Dahlgren has more on this one. And Kristen, this is, an unusual, rather extraordinary situation here. And there's a bit of a caveat to this apology from Siebold. She says she, quote, unwittingly played a role in the system that has sent an innocent man to jail. Explain what she might be getting at here.
Right. And she's actually getting some criticism for not coming right out and saying what we all know she's talking about, which is the systemic racism in our country and in our court system. Listen, he was convicted on two things, this hair evidence that was later found to be faulty, and then Siebold's account of what happened. And she had picked him out earlier, but then when it came to the lineup, she actually chose a different man. And according to the exoneration, prosecutors then coached her, told her that she had picked the wrong man, and she was able to change her story. And so, the criticism that she's getting today for that apology is that she didn't come right out and talk about her role in systemic racism.
Broadwater is talking about this a little bit, too. I mean, this is somebody who spent 16 years in prison for a crime that we now know he did not do. What's he saying?
Right, and he was denied parole 5 times. Look, his life was completely destroyed by this. He talks about how he never had kids even after he got out of prison because he didn't want to bring them into this world. And so his life changed. When he was exonerated, he said that he just wanted a sincere apology. And then after he got it, he did release a statement. He says that he accepts her apology and he appreciated it, that it did take courage for her to do that. And he really has no malice towards her, and he's relieved to finally move on from this.
The reason a lot of this came to light, Kristen, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was basically a documentary crew that was doing something on this, right? That was sort of talking about this case. They're now creating this.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was actually going to be a film on her story, her memoir, Lucky. And the producer who was making it started to notice these inconsistencies, and he was the one that hired a private investigator and led to the exoneration. He is now making a documentary starring Anthony Broadwater. He, of course, isn't going to make any money from it. Keep in mind that Siebold made, I think, $3 million from her memoir. But there will be this documentary which will outline it. Also, this is interesting. His private investigator says that he found the real suspect, Hallie.
Oh, that is interesting. We'll have to leave it there for now. But Kristen Dahlgren, thank you for bringing that story to us. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all of your time and for watching this show, Hallie Jackson Now. We'll see you here tomorrow, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.